There have been many iconic dinosaurs that have graced our world, from roaming the earth in our past to haunting the imaginations of the present. The most famous, of course, being the tyrant king itself, Tyrannosaurus rex, one of the most recognizable and ferocious animals to ever walk on land. But amongst these animals was a creature that truly rivaled this tyrant in every aspect, whose scent would have struck fear into any T.rex. A prehistoric icon with triple horns and the frill adorning its skull like a crown. A skull that was amongst the largest of any known land animal ever. The three-horned face itself, Triceratops. Triceratops is a dinosaur that needs little introduction. A gigantic horned dinosaur from the late Cretaceous period, once widespread throughout western North America 68 to 66 million years ago, at the very twilight of the age of dinosaurs. In fact, it's one of the most common dinosaurs found in the American Northwest, to the point where if you're a paleontology student, chances are your first dinosaur might be a Triceratops. This commonality has led Triceratops to be one of the most well-studied and well-understood dinosaurs ever discovered. Ironic when you consider the journey to the three-horned animal we know today had a pretty confusing starting point. Triceratops wasn't just any dinosaur discovery, but one made during the most intense event in paleontology ever known, the Bone Wars. The competition, nay, the sheer conflict between Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope that led to the discovery of the many iconic American dinosaurs discovered during the late 19th century, in a race to see who could collect and name as many new taxa from the American frontier, many of which being dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, the various long-necked dinosaurs like Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus. The list goes on. So the last thing you would expect from one of the most iconic dinosaurs of all time would be getting mistaken for a bison, when it was discovered by Marsh in 1887, sharing the same thick curved brow horn sprouting from the top of the skull. That all changed a year later in 1888, in a quiet ravine in the Badlands of Wyoming. A cowboy named Edmund B. Wilson, working the land, had come upon a massive skull sticking out of the ravine, with massive horns sprouting from its brows, longer and larger than any living animal. Startled, but fascinated by the sight, he lassoed the horns and attempted to pull them free from the cliff, and after a great effort, freed the horns from the cliff, while the rest of the skull came tumbling down with them. Wilson collected the broken off horns and brought them to his boss, Charles Arthur Guernsey, who himself was an avid fossil collector, and was just as excited by this find, and wasted little time in contacting fellow, and now famous, fossil hunter John Bell Hatcher. Hatcher reported his find to Marsh, who demanded he collect the horns and salvage the bits of skull he could. In Marsh's hands, the skull underwent endless days of preparation, scraping away the sediment and piecing together the skull bit by bit, including a third, smaller horn that would be placed on the snout, until after months of work, Marsh unveiled the skull of a creature unlike anything the world had ever seen. And upon realizing they bore a similarity to the great brow horns he had found a year before, he would go on to describe a new species of animal, a new species of dinosaur, Triceratops horridus, the rough three-horned face. The species name horridus being in reference to the rough texture of the skull and horns. A discovery so significant, of a creature so magnificent, that it became one of the first dinosaurs ever mounted in a museum. Since then, Triceratops has changed rather smoothly compared to most dinosaurs, Thanks to its abundance of fossils throughout the American West, it's a rather completely known dinosaur, and as a result, its reconstructions have been able to evolve with our ever-growing understanding of dinosaurs. Going from a sluggish, tail-dragging, three-horned beast to a stocky, athletic, three-horned behemoth with a shorter tail. And it's this solid understanding that has allowed us to learn an incredible amount about this animal, including what they looked like. Now, the first thing you might expect Triceratops to look like would be a rhino or an elephant, right? Being big, burly herbivores with big, sharp appendages sticking out of their faces, it seems like a no-brainer. But the real twist is that Triceratops wasn't much like either, outside of the superficial aspects of being, a giant horned herbivore. But once you get past the superficial and start taking a closer look, you discover a whole other beast. Literally. For one thing, Triceratops didn't have the wrinkly skin like those of elephants and rhinos, but instead were covered in interlocking hexagonal scales. A fact paleontologists are well aware of thanks to rare occasions of Triceratops fossils preserving skin impressions and even soft tissue, revealing scaly exteriors to the scientists. What's more, this scaly integument was practically uniform, with the exception of large round scales decorating their hides. Their shape jokingly referred to as nipple scales, due to their outward projections. Even the most superficial aspects of Triceratops differed from elephants and rhinos, that being the horns. Rhino horns are made of modified keratin composed of hair, while elephant tusks are made of ivory. Triceratops, on the other hand, had horns made of solid bone, with the horn cores surrounded by a keratinous sheath in a similar manner to cattle, which would have extended the length of the horns. As different they were on the outside, as you look beneath the surface, the differences are even more obvious, particularly how each animal is built. Like rhinos and elephants, Triceratops utilized robust, upright limbs to carry their massive weight, a trait necessary for large, active animals. But unlike rhinos and elephants, the forelimbs were elegant and semi-sprawled, with trackways showing this unusual gait, with its arms and feet almost pointing inwards as it moved. What's more, these trackways also reveal another different characteristic from modern herbivores. Unlike rhinos, Triceratops didn't have hooves, and unlike elephants or rhinos, they didn't have the round circular pads on their feet either. Each foot had individual functional digits that almost resembled a cross between a crocodile and a tapir, utilizing powerful shoulders and wide hips and robust vertebrae to carry and distribute its tremendous weight, with adults reaching 26 to 30 feet in length and 6 to 10 tons, growing even larger than an African bush elephant, and by far one of, if not the largest ceratopsid. Ceratopsids were the family of dinosaurs known as the horned dinosaurs, including the likes of Triceratops, Chasmosaurus, Centrosaurus, Pachyrhinosaurus, etc. Large quadrupedal herbivores with decorated frills sprouting from the back of their skulls and unique arrangements of facial horns, some even evolving massive battering rams on their snouts. These unusual characteristics tell an evolutionary story in themselves, one tracing back all the way to the Jurassic over 150 million years ago. Back then, ceratopsians were neither large nor horned, not even quadrupedal. Instead, they were tiny, big-headed bipeds, walking on two legs with inward-facing hands, and small, pointy, tusk-like fangs in their beaks, and they would remain that way throughout most of their natural history. Not exactly the intimidating giants of the Cretaceous, but it was during the mid-Cretaceous when things began to change, with an extinction event known as the Cenomanian Ocean Anoxic Event, a cascade of environmental changes caused by the disturbance of Earth's carbon cycle, not unlike those we're experiencing today, one that led to a global mass extinction of various large animals. In the absence of large herbivores, new opportunities arose for smaller creatures like primitive ceratopsians to begin to evolve larger body sizes to take the roles left open by extinct herbivores that preceded them. And as they began to grow, they began to transition to walk on four legs for larger body sizes and digestive systems, with their hands becoming strong but dainty toes, while their skulls grew larger and more decorative. But following them every step of the way were the tyrannosaurs. Just like ceratopsians, they too emerged during the Jurassic. In fact, they were the principal predators of these early ceratopsians, also starting as smaller, more nimble animals, with both lineages emerging in Asia over 150 million years ago, and had existed in a constant state of coevolution, or a state where two closely associated organisms evolve in response to one another, one that led to the latest and largest of the ceratopsids by the end of the Cretaceous. Currently, there are two accepted species of Triceratops, Triceratops horridus and Triceratops prorsus, its descendant. While nearly identical from a distance, there are key factors that set the two apart, mainly their skulls, with the nasal horn of Triceratops horridus being placed higher along its more shallow snout, while Triceratops prorsus has a slightly deeper snout with a longer nasal horn that sprouts on the lower end of the snout, closer to the beak. But even these differences, while crucial, are still difficult to decipher, due to how variable the growth of Triceratops skull ornaments can be, with each individual having their own uniquely shaped horns and frills, each distinct as our own faces and fingerprints. This variation has led to confusion throughout the years when classifying different specimens of Triceratops, until the later 1990s and 2000s that split the genus into two species we currently recognize, based on their distinctive characteristics, while also separated chronologically, with Triceratops horridus being older by just a couple million years. In fact, it's been suggested that Triceratops prorsus is a direct descendant of Triceratops horridus, with several intermediate specimens showcasing the transition from one species to another. It's an interesting showcase of anagenesis amongst dinosaurs. Anagenesis referring to an animal's transitional line of descent throughout their evolution, in this case, the evolution of T. horridus to T. prorsus. The individuality amongst Triceratops has led to many paleontologists suggesting that these ornaments played a key role in identification and display, allowing Triceratops to identify one another more easily, as well as measure how old and how fit each individual is based on the length and quality of their horns and frills. More remarkably, the blood vessels in the frills were potentially able to generate bright display colors, creating more dazzling displays to communicate mood, attract mates, or intimidate threats. And if showing off didn't work, then the horns stopped being for show and started being for attack. With a pair of brow horns being over a meter long and an average skull length of 3 times the size, Triceratops had one of the largest, most terrifying skulls of any land animal. However, the horns of Triceratops weren't the only thing striking about the dinosaur's skull. Its frill is actually stand out, in that unlike most ceratopsids, it is composed almost entirely of solid bone. Compared to most ceratopsids, who had two large holes in the centers of their frills called fenestrae, in order to lighten the weight of their massive skulls. These frills evolved mainly as display tools, but in the case of Triceratops, it seems that their frills evolved to mediate damage during jousts and horn locks in interspecific combat, with fossils preserving gouges and scratches and even puncture marks created by the brow horns locking together, with its semi-sprawled gait giving it increased agility, keeping attackers in front of this armored herbivore, moving almost like an angry crab on four legs. It was an animal evolved to keep itself in front of its opponent at all times, able to spin and turn on a dime. The defense of the frill wasn't perfect, and while it was made of solid bone and tissue, dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus could still punch through it, or even take a chunk out of it. Instead, the frill is more a buffer to the neck rather than stopping a Tyrannosaurus dead in its tracks, working in tandem with the horns to make the vulnerable neck much more difficult to reach. This is made more efficient by the ball and socket joint at the back of the skull, acting as a connecting point to the rest of the body. A nearly perfect sphere that allowed Triceratops and other ceratopsids to swing their heads nearly 180 degrees in all directions. It's not like a rhino that can only thrust up and down, but can swing from side to side, angle to angle, as well as up and down. The semi-sprawled forelimbs come back into play, acting as additional springboards to launch the animal forward and upwards, allowing them to thrust their horns into attackers. The head itself is a biomechanical marvel. While you might think such a massive head is difficult to carry, Triceratops managed to compensate by developing stronger neck muscles and more robust forelimbs to carry the weight without the need of fenestrae to lighten the skull. With its tiny brain protected by several layers of bone and spongy tissue, almost like a helmet, allowing Triceratops to charge and collide while reducing the risk of brain damage and absorbing the shock of impact. From a combination of lethal horns, an armored skull, and attached to an animal with remarkable agility for its size, Triceratops was one of the most powerful herbivores to ever walk on land. But even these powerful giants had small, humble beginnings, hatching from eggs only a fraction of the size of their parents, and differed in more ways than just said size. From birth, Triceratops possessed 3 horns and frills that they were known for, but a set that were far less developed than those of their parents. A fact paleontologists came all too aware of with the discovery of the first baby Triceratops fossils around the 2000s, with the study describing each specimen in 2006, documenting the various different Triceratops skulls on record at the time, revealing an expected yet astonishing set of growth stages that transitioned a tiny, bumpy baby to a horned titan. When Triceratops are born, their size is not only small, but so are their ornaments, with the frill being short and scalped in a shallow angle pointing backwards. Interestingly, the horns are already present so early in development, but they're tiny nubs compared to what they would eventually grow into. Their entire facial structure was also rather different, yet expected for what you might think of a baby Triceratops, with big eyes in proportion to its head and a shorter concave muzzle. As they matured and grew larger, so did the facial adornments, with the horns growing longer from the orbital bones above the eyes, curving backwards in an almost Loki-like shape. The frill also continues to sprout, and the scalp shape of the baby frill transitions to a taller, juvenile shield, going from the sprouting backwards to curving upwards, lined with several bony triangular protrusions called scutes, lining the frill for additional protection. As Triceratops finally reached maturity, the triangular scutes on the rims of the frill reabsorbed back into the bone, turning the pointed projections into shallow rosettes. The horns, sprouting upwards, would begin to curve and point forwards, growing thicker and more robust, especially in the nasal horn. And by the time of adulthood, the face had transformed into a long, robust muzzle with powerful jaws for snapping through plants. Triceratops had a lot of growing up to do, to say the least, and much of this growth was supplemented by a diet high in fibers, as one of the most efficient feeders of the Cretaceous, evolving a strong and sturdy beak to rip through vegetation and snap branches off of trees, feeding on cycads, ferns, and palms, using batteries of teeth to grind through tough plants in its own form of chewing, while evolving wide hips and a more rotund body shape to support a larger gut, in order to digest and process some of the toughest plants of the era, being consumed on a regular basis. It's even been proposed that this diet of tough fibrous plants may have given this herbivore the strongest bite of any land animal, even rivaling T.rex, but research is still ongoing. Of course, these varying growth stages have led to Triceratops' most infamous controversy, the proposed lumping with its close cousin, Torosaurus, a dinosaur that, because of its close relation to Triceratops, looks extremely similar in size and anatomy, differing only in the structure of their frills, with Torosaurus retaining its massive fenestrae and its massive, even taller frill, while possessing a similar three-horned appearance, growing to similar sizes, and even living in the same time and place. This similarity and proximity to one another got a few scientists considering a controversial idea, and it was proposed that Triceratops and Torosaurus were one and the same, with Torosaurus representing what a mature Triceratops would look like, with the absence of fenestrae and Triceratops' frills being ontogenetic, or the result of growth stages. But there are some holes in this theory, ones that have since gotten the Toro Triceratops idea debunked in its totality by this point, including a lack of transitional forms. For example, as I mentioned before, we do have several specimens of Torosaurus and Triceratops growing to similar sizes, and we also happen to have subadult Torosaurus, and they look very different from Triceratops, specifically adult Triceratops, showcasing their own distinct characteristics by this stage rather than transitioning from Triceratops to adult Torosaurus, especially when it comes to the fenestrae, with the fossils currently on record showcasing no transitional point from the solid frills of suspected adult Triceratops and subadult Triceratops to the fenestrate frills of subadult Torosaurus. In other words, we don't have any Triceratops specimens showing any signs of holes naturally forming in the frill, as well as any other transitional points to the other unique characteristics of Torosaurus. And it doesn't help that those who initially proposed this hypothesis also lumped in a very problematic genus of Ceratopsid, called Nidoceratops. A very problematic genus all in itself because of its taxonomic instability, mainly whether its characteristics represent a distinct genus or a distinct individual in the genus Triceratops. A point that only continues to draw further scrutiny against the Toro-Trike theory. The cherry on top of all of this being more recent discoveries of juvenile and baby ceratopsids, with baby Chasmosaurus showcasing that they were in fact born with fenestrae reminiscent of their parents, while baby Triceratops had solid frills, like their parents. For now, based on current evidence, it's more likely that Triceratops and Torosaurus similarities are more likely due to their close relation, and it's likely that Torosaurus was retaining its ancestral characteristics. Between these radical changes throughout growth stages and slow growing history, It's further supportive that the horns and frills of Triceratops, and by extension, other horned dinosaurs, were social display tools, with their growth communicating visual cues and signals as well as identification, especially for social interactions. Triceratops is often characterized as a herding animal, thanks in part to modern animals being used as analogs, and several Triceratops bone beds having been discovered containing the remains of potential herds, or at least the remains of family groups, along with the bone beds of other ceratopsids like Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, and Pachyrhinosaurus, buried and preserved together as the result of sudden events and natural disasters such as seasonal flash floods. Typically, because Triceratops bone beds are nowhere near as numerous in their casualties as other ceratopsid bone beds, it's been suspected they were less social, at least compared to other horned dinosaurs. Of course, as mentioned before, we still have a couple Triceratops bone beds, including a bone bed containing 2 adults and a juvenile, 2 bone beds containing at least 7 adult individuals, presenting the possibility that Triceratops instead formed smaller, more close-knit groups compared to herds of, say, Centrosaurus, whose herd members ranged in the hundreds. And it's been proposed that Triceratops was less social compared to other known horned dinosaurs. It's certainly possible, in fact, it's even plausible. Even in the modern day, closely related animals can vary in social behaviors. In addition, Triceratops was slow growing, and this slow growth relative to other dinosaurs indicates that parental care was at least a factor, with parents protecting their young for longer periods to ensure they reach maturity. Then again, it's important to remember that just because we don't find animals buried with their family members, it doesn't mean they weren't social. Individual members of a herd can and do die of individual complications and circumstances, and herds will move on while the body, of course, stays behind. So while we find Triceratops remains without the company of others, it's not conclusive on how social Triceratops truly was. Social or otherwise, it was clear that Triceratops was a fairly common and widespread dinosaur in the American West. During the late Cretaceous period, the North America Triceratops knew was a fairly different place. That is, if you don't live in Florida. Back then, North America was in the midst of taking a familiar shape, with the seaway that once split the landmass in two beginning to shrink northwards. Triceratops lived in the coastal regions near this seaway, with the rich coastal climate feeding marshes, floodplains, and fern prairies, in a landscape that resembled northern and central Florida. Ceratopsids like Triceratops and Torosaurus were amongst the most common herbivores in the region, alongside the region's other dominant herbivores, duckbills or hadrosaurs, most notably Edmontosaurus, which were also extremely common. In the more forested areas, other large herbivores like Ankylosaurus, a massive armored dinosaur, shuffled through the brush to feed on low-lying plants, roots, and tubers. Small, distant relatives of Triceratops thrived here too, including pachycephalosaurs like Pachycephalosaurus, Stygimoloch, and Spherotholus. Smaller, deer-sized headbutters with large domes crowning their skulls. On the more gracile side of the spectrum were the herbivorous theropods like Ornithomimus, a distant cousin to modern birds that very much looked like a modern emu or ostrich. But not every theropod here preferred plants. The title of largest predator goes to the mortal enemies of all horned dinosaurs, the tyrannosaurs, specifically Tyrannosaurus rex. With powerful, crushing jaws, long, powerful legs built for speed, living in the same place, in the same environment as Triceratops, with Triceratops being amongst their most favored prey, with various fossils showcasing this predator-prey relationship in brutal detail. Various Triceratops fossils showcase bite marks, scattered rex teeth, and even T.rex teeth embedded in the bones themselves. Triceratops, on the other hand, was more than capable of standing its ground against any rex, be they alone or in the company of their herds. And it's more than likely many of these hunting attempts from hungry Tyrannosaurus failed more times than they succeeded on Triceratops, especially if they were facing off with the adults. Between Triceratops being able to swing and thrust their massive skulls in all directions, skulls that have two gigantic facial horns sprouting from their brows, meant that a single misstep from a Tyrannosaurus would lead to deadly consequences. There's even fossil evidence of Rex attacks being thwarted by Triceratops, with broken horns and frills caused by T-Rex bites. Yet these bites showcase signs of healing, revealing that these Triceratops not only survived these encounters, but lived long enough for their wounds to heal completely. With a deadly arsenal of facial weapons to some of the most efficient feeding mechanisms of its time, it allowed Triceratops to be one of the most widespread herbivores of Cretaceous North America. So prevalent, in fact, that we even have fossils of Triceratops right up to the KT boundary, the boundary that marks the end of the age of dinosaurs, and within its strata contain the scars of the earth laced with ash and iridium, revealing how cataclysmic this end truly was. An asteroid the size of Everest slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, creating a cataclysmic chain of events bordering on the apocalyptic, devastating the Earth's climate and killing over 70% of all life on Earth, with Triceratops being the mightiest amongst these casualties, going extinct as the age of dinosaurs came to a close. Although Triceratops may not be around today, its fossils have afforded us a gateway into the age of dinosaurs in astounding detail. And as a result, it's become a true staple in all manner of dinosaur-related media by sparking so many imaginations. Triceratops has always had star power, and it shows when a good chunk of books, movies, and video games feature Triceratops as a fighter, one strong enough to rival even the most gigantic dinosaurs in raw power and ferociousness. Starting back all the way to the Ghost of Slumber Mountain and the original Lost World film, to the various cartoons and characters they've inspired since. And more often than not, just like the real animals, Triceratops is often trading blows with T.rex as its physical match. There are very few rivalries that are this eternal and this intense, and it's this same rivalry that's helped further both dinosaurs into becoming the icons we adore. Even outside of its rivalry, Triceratops still continues to appear in dinosaur-related projects in a number of roles. From a tough and dangerous herbivore chasing people through the jungle, to even being one of the protagonists themselves. Sometimes even appearing just as a dinosaur to remind us how huge and astounding these animals were, and most importantly, how familiar they are to the giants still around today. Its depiction in the first Jurassic Park film is one such instance, with so much so that the animatronic was covered in dirt to emulate reddish-brown colors of rolling in dust. Triceratops is one of the greats, not just as a dinosaur, but as an animal all in itself. An icon that stands on the same pillars and same toy shelves as lions, elephants, and of course T.rex. Taking its place as the roughest, toughest, most beloved three-horned face the world has ever seen.